The moment Henrietta Bell realized she was being handed off like a saddlebag full of unwanted gear, the Arizona sun was already high and merciless, and the man who had dragged her across 3 territories without so much as asking her name was counting coins into another man's palm at the dusty Crossroads outside of Yuma. It was the spring of 1882, and the desert was unforgiving in the way that only the desert could be, all cracked earth and shimmering heat, and the distant cry of a hawk circling something it had already decided was done for. Henrietta stood with her wrists loosely bound in front of her brown traveling dress thick with road dust, her dark hair falling loose from the pins that had given up somewhere around the New Mexico border. She was 24 years old, and she had already survived more than most women her age would ever be asked to survive, but standing at that crossroads while 2 men decided her fate without consulting her, that was a particular kind of humiliation she had never quite gotten used to. The man who had transported her was named Dob Carraway. He was a hired hand, nothing more, contracted by her late father's business partner, a man called Silas Grange, to bring Henrietta from her home in Santa Fe to a ranch outside of Tucson where Silas Grange fully expected her to arrive, be grateful, and marry his eldest son without complaint. Dob Carraway had never once mistreated her physically. He was not that sort of man, but he had also never once treated her as a person of any consequence. She was cargo. She had always been cargo to Silas Grange, and apparently now she was cargo to whoever Dob Carraway was counting those coins out to. She studied the second man with the particular careful attention of someone who has learned that details matter when your circumstances are beyond your control. He was tall, wide through the shoulders, with a lean, weathered quality that suggested he spent more time outside than in. His hat was dark brown and well worn, the kind that had seen real weather and not just sun. He wore a plain gray shirt and canvas trousers, scuffed boots, and a single gun belt that sat low on his right hip in the easy way of a man who didn't wear it for show. His face was angular, a strong jaw, a nose that had been broken at least once, eyes that were a deep, still gray like the sky before a thunderstorm. He looked to be somewhere in his early 30s, with a few lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into the sun for years. He was not a pretty man in the way that some men in cities were pretty, but he was striking in the way that the desert landscape itself was striking, all stark lines and undeniable presence. He had not yet looked at her directly. Dob Carraway folded the coins into his jacket pocket, touched the brim of his hat in Henrietta's direction, a gesture she found grotesquely casual given the circumstances, and climbed back onto his horse. He pointed vaguely at the tall man as if offering a final piece of instruction. "She's to go to Tucson. Grange'll be expecting her. You got the address." He handed over a folded piece of paper and then, without another word, rode back in the direction they had come from, leaving a thin trail of dust behind him. Henrietta watched him go. She did not call after him. She did not cry. She had cried already, weeks ago, when her father's death had set this whole wretched machinery in motion, and she had made a private bargain with herself that she would not waste tears on men like Dob Carraway or Silas Grange. The tall man stood with the folded paper in one hand and looked at it for a long moment. Then he tucked it into his shirt pocket without opening it, and for the first time he turned and looked at her directly. His gray eyes moved over the rope at her wrists with an expression that Henrietta could not quite name, not pity exactly, and not discomfort, but something steady and very deliberate, as if he was making a decision about something and wanted to be sure he made it correctly. He reached into his boot and produced a short-handled folding knife, and Henrietta took one instinctive step backward. "Easy," he said. His voice was low and even, without rough edges. "I am going to cut those off." She held very still while he stepped forward and sliced through the rope with 2 clean strokes. The rope fell into the dust. Henrietta rubbed her wrists, more out of habit than necessity since Carraway had not tied them tight enough to leave marks, and she looked up at the man standing in front of her. "Thank you," she said, because she had been raised to say thank you and she meant it, and she also wanted to hear how he responded. "You are welcome," he said and put the knife away. They stood in the heat of the crossroads for a moment. In three directions, the road disappeared into the flat scrub desert. In one direction, southeast, the road presumably led toward Tucson. A wagon sat nearby with two horses hitched to it, a solid bay mare and a younger roan, both of them patient in the heat. "My name is Peter Monroe," the tall man said. "Henrietta Bell," she said. He nodded once as if storing that away carefully. "I was paid to bring you to a man named Grange in Tucson," he said. His voice was straightforward, without apology or performance. "I know," Henrietta said. "I also know I was not consulted about any of this." Peter Monroe studied her face for a moment and then looked out across the desert toward the southeast. "No," he said, "I expect you were not." "I will not be going to Sela's Grange," Henrietta said. She said it clearly and without trembling, which she was quietly proud of. "I am telling you this now so there is no confusion later." Peter Monroe turned back to look at her. He was quiet for what felt like a long time but was probably only 10 seconds. Then he said something that she had not expected. "Where do you want to go?" The question landed on her like a drop of cold water in the middle of all that heat. Nobody had asked her that. Not her father's business partners when they'd started making arrangements. Not Dob Carraway. Not Sela's Grange, who had written her exactly one letter that read less like a proposal and more like a property survey. "Where do you want to go?" Henrietta realized she had not thought about it. She had spent so much energy resisting the destination that had been assigned to her that she had not given real thought to where she might actually choose to go if anyone ever bothered to ask. "I need a moment to think about that," she said honestly. Peter Monroe nodded. "All right." He walked to the wagon and pulled out a canteen, walked back and held it out to her. "Drink. You look like you have not had water in a while." She took the canteen and drank, and the water was warm but clean, and she felt something unknot slightly in the center of her chest. She handed the canteen back and looked at him steadily. "You were paid to bring me to Tucson." "I was," he said. "Does that payment obligate you?" He looked at the folded paper in his pocket. Then he took it out and looked at the address written on it. Then he folded it again and held it in his hand without putting it back. "Money obligates a man to a job," he said slowly. "But there are jobs and there are jobs." He looked at her. "What is in Tucson for you?" "A marriage I did not agree to," she said. "To a man I have never met. Arranged by a man who held my father's debts, and apparently felt that collecting me was equivalent to collecting the money owed." Peter Monroe's expression did not change dramatically, but something in his gray eyes shifted, a deepening of that stillness, a tightening around the jaw. He looked at the paper in his hand one more time and then folded it into quarters and put it in his shirt pocket. "There is a town called Marable," he said, "about 40 miles north of here. It is a fair town, has a proper sheriff, 2 churches, a school. The kind of place a person could get their footing if they needed to start somewhere." Henrietta looked north along the road. 40 miles was not nothing. 40 miles in the Arizona heat on a wagon was the better part of 2 days. "Why are you telling me about Marable?" she asked. Peter Monroe looked at her with those quiet gray eyes. "Because you said you needed a moment to think, and I thought giving you a real option might help the thinking." Henrietta Bell stood at the crossroads in the spring heat of 1882, with the dust of 3 territories on her dress and the rope mark fading from her wrists, and for the first time in months she felt something that was not dread or resignation but something faintly, tentatively like possibility. "All right," she said. "Marable." Peter Monroe nodded and walked to the wagon. He climbed up to the bench and then looked back at her from that height, waiting with a patience that was not impatient or performative. She walked to the wagon and he offered her a hand up, which she took, and she settled herself on the bench beside him and adjusted her skirt and looked out at the road ahead. He flicked the reins lightly, and the horses started forward and the crossroads fell behind them. Neither of them spoke for a while. Henrietta was not uncomfortable with the silence. She had always been a woman who could sit quietly without needing to fill the air with noise, which was something her mother had taught her, and which had served her well in various difficult circumstances. She watched the desert move past them, the scrub and the saguaro and the hard pale blue sky, and she thought about Marable, which she had never heard of, and about the fact that a stranger had just altered the entire course of her life by asking a single question. "You have done that before," she said after a while. "Changed course like that. You did not even hesitate." Peter Monroe glanced at her sideways. "What makes you say that?" "Because a man who hesitates looks like he is hesitating," she said. "You just decided." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother was brought somewhere she did not choose to go," he said simply. "It did not go well for her." Henrietta looked at him. She waited in case there was more. There was not more, and she did not push for it. Some things were given only once, and the receiving of them had to be done quietly. "I am sorry about your mother," she said. "Thank you," he said, with the same plainness with which she had thanked him for cutting the rope, and she understood that they were both people who meant what they said and did not embellish. They made good progress through the afternoon, stopping once by a shallow creek to water the horses and rest in what little shade a cluster of scrubby cottonwoods could provide. Henrietta climbed down from the wagon and walked to the creek's edge and rinsed her face and hands and felt considerably more human for it. Peter Monroe watered both horses and then sat on a flat rock near the creek and ate some hardtack from his pack and offered her the same. She sat on a nearby rock and ate, and they looked out at the creek together, which was not really much of a creek but was doing its best. "What brings a man like you to a job like that?" Henrietta asked. She asked it without accusation because she genuinely wanted to understand him. "A man like me," he said. "A man who clearly has a conscience," she said. "Escorting unwilling women to arranged marriages is not generally the work of men with active consciences." The corner of his mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. "I did not know the full situation when I took the job," he said. "Grange told me I was bringing a widow's daughter to join her fiancé in Tucson. He said it was a love match that had been arranged before her father's death, and that she had simply lost her way traveling alone." Henrietta stared at him. "That is an extraordinary amount of fiction." "Yes," Peter Monroe said. "I have been reconsidering my business associations with Silas Grange for some time now. Today finished that reconsidering." She was quiet for a moment, watching the creek move slowly over its pale stones. "He holds a debt," she said. "My father owed him a significant sum. He died without settling it. Grange decided I was the settlement." "That is not legal," Peter Monroe said. "No," Henrietta agreed. "It is not legal. It is also not particularly unusual in certain parts of the territory where the law is thin and powerful men do as they like." She looked at her hands, still damp from the creek. "My father was not a bad man. He was not a careful one. He trusted Grange because Grange had been charming to him for 20 years. By the time he understood what Grange truly was, it was too late to do very much about it." Peter Monroe watched her as she spoke. He had the quality of a man who listened with his whole attention, not simply waiting for his turn to speak, and Henrietta found that she appreciated this about him more than she could immediately articulate. "Did you have family elsewhere?" he asked. "Someone you were trying to reach?" She shook her head slowly. "My mother died when I was 12. My father had a sister in Missouri, but she passed 2 years ago. There is no one." She said it without self-pity, as a simple statement of fact. "I have some money of my own, not much, but some. My father's pocket watch, which I intend to keep. A good pair of hands and a working knowledge of bookkeeping, which my father taught me, and apparently now a vague destination of Marable, Arizona, which you have suggested. It is a good town," he said again. "You know it well." "I pass through it regularly," he said. "I run freight between a few of the settlements in this part of the territory. Marable is on my route." Something about this information settled the situation into a clearer shape for Henrietta. He was not a drifter. He was not a man of violence or mystery or dangerous purpose. He was a freight hauler with a conscience and a mother who had once been taken somewhere she had not chosen to go, and he had decided somewhere in the last 20 minutes of a dusty Crossroads conversation that delivering Henrietta Bell to Sela's Grange was not something he was willing to do. She found that she trusted him. She was not sure she had earned the right to that trust yet, or whether it was wise, but it was there regardless, a quiet, solid thing, like the flat rock she was sitting on. They climbed back into the wagon as the afternoon began its slow lean toward evening, and they drove until the light turned copper and the shadows stretched long across the desert floor. Peter Monroe found a decent campsite off the road in the lee of a low red rock formation that cut the wind, and he set about making camp with the efficient economy of a man who had done this a great many times. He got a fire going, put water on for coffee, and produced from the back of the wagon a proper bedroll that he set on the far side of the fire. "You will take the bedroll," he said. "I will sleep in the wagon." "That seems like a poor arrangement for you," Henrietta said. "I have slept in the wagon before," he said. "It is a very comfortable wagon." He said this last part with the tone of a man telling a small, friendly lie, and Henrietta almost smiled. She took the bedroll and she drank the coffee he made, which was strong and slightly bitter and the best thing she had tasted in days, and she sat by the fire and watched the stars come out over the desert in that particular desert way, profligate and extravagant, as if the sky could not help showing off. "Are you afraid?" he asked. He was sitting across the fire from her, holding his coffee, looking into the flames. She thought about it honestly. "Not at this exact moment," she said. "Earlier today I was very afraid. I have been afraid for several weeks." He nodded. "Are you afraid of anything?" she asked, not as a challenge but with genuine curiosity. He was quiet for longer than she expected. "I am afraid of failing to do the right thing when the right thing is difficult," he said. "I have done it before, failed. I do not enjoy the memory." "What happened?" she asked, and then immediately, "You do not have to answer that." "No, it is all right." He looked at the fire. "There was a woman in a town I passed through years back. Her husband was cruel. People in the town knew it. I knew it. I stayed 3 days and I saw enough to know she was suffering, and I told myself it was not my business and I moved on." He paused. "She died the following winter. I heard about it from a trader on the road." The fire crackled between them. "An owl called somewhere out in the dark desert, low and measured." "You could not have known that would happen," Henrietta said carefully. "No," he agreed. "But I could have done something. I could have spoken to the sheriff. I could have spoken to her. I could have done something besides deciding it was not my concern." He looked at her. "I have thought about that woman a great deal in the years since. I do not want to make that kind of decision again." Henrietta looked at him across the fire. She understood now, more fully, why he had cut the rope at the Crossroads. Not only because of his mother, but because of that woman in the unnamed town, and because he was a man who had taken stock of his own failings and made a private determination to do better. In her experience, that kind of man was rare. She slept deeply and without dreaming for the first time in weeks, with the desert air cool around her and the fire burning low, and the sound of the night insects filling the darkness like a kind of music. In the morning, she woke to the smell of coffee again and the sound of Peter Monroe seeing to the horses. He had already hitched them back to the wagon and was filling the canteens from a small barrel in the wagon bed. The sky was the pale pink of early morning, and the air was still cool enough to be pleasant. She smoothed her dress and retied her hair and washed her face with water from the canteen he held out to her without being asked, and then they ate some dried meat and biscuits from his provisions and got back on the road. The second day of travel was different from the first, easier in some ways, heavier in others, because the initial emergency of the situation had passed, and what was left was the long middle of it, with all of its practical realities. Henrietta found herself thinking about Marable with more specific attention. She had $40 sewn into the lining of her traveling bag, which was not a great fortune but was not nothing. She had skills bookkeeping, as she had said, but also a careful hand with figures and letters, and the ability to manage accounts that her father had taught her from girlhood, being as he was a man who had always considered her his most capable child, and she had been his only child. She was thinking through these things in an orderly way when Peter Monroe said, "The general store in Marable is run by a man called Hector Voss. He is fair. His wife is fair. If you need a safe place to ask for help when we arrive, that would be where I would go." Henrietta looked at him. He had clearly been thinking about her situation while she had been thinking about it herself, and the fact that he had been thinking about it, working out how to make it better for her rather than working out how to use it for himself, made something warm move through her chest. "Thank you," she said. "I will remember that." He nodded and looked at the road. "You should know," she said, "that I intend to make a proper life in Marable, not just to hide from Selah's Grange, though that is part of it. I mean to work and build something real." "I believe you," he said, and he said it simply, without the patronizing encouragement she had sometimes received from men who meant well but could not quite bring themselves to believe a woman meant what she said. "Grange will likely look for me," she said. "Yes," Peter Monroe said, "he will." "Will he come after you?" Peter Monroe considered this. "He may try. He is not a man who accepts losses easily." He paused. "But I have had dealings with men like Grange before, and I have found that their willingness to pursue a fight is closely related to how much they believe the other party can be frightened. I am not easily frightened." This was not braggadocio. It was simply a fact, stated in the same tone he used for everything else, and Henrietta believed it completely. They reached the outskirts of Marable in the late afternoon of the second day, coming over a low rise and looking down at a small town settled into a wide valley with mountains in the distance turning purple in the afternoon light. There were maybe 200 buildings, houses, a main street with a row of businesses, 2 church steeples, a livery, a schoolhouse at the northern edge. Cattle grazed on the slopes to the west. It looked, as Peter Monroe had described it, like a place where a person could get their footing. Henrietta straightened on the wagon bench and felt something in her posture change, a kind of settling of resolution, a firming of the spine that had nothing to do with the road's roughness. They drove down the main street at a walk, and Henrietta looked at everything, cataloging, the way she had learned to catalog things, because the only power you truly had in an uncertain world was the power of observation. Peter Monroe pulled up in front of a solid-looking building with a sign that said VOSS General Merchandise. He set the brake and climbed down and came around to offer her a hand, and she took it and stepped down onto Marable's Main Street for the first time. The general store was warm and smelled of sawdust and tobacco and dried goods, and behind the counter stood a broad, dark-haired man in his mid-40s with kind eyes, and a woman beside him who was clearly his wife, smaller, red-haired, sharp-faced in a way that read as intelligence rather than severity. "Peter Monroe," the man said with genuine pleasure. "You are a few days ahead of your usual schedule." "Had some reason to move quickly," Peter Monroe said. He brought Henrietta forward. "Hector, this is Henrietta Bell. She is new to Marable and needs to find her footing. She is good with accounts and figures. I told her you would treat her fairly." Hector Voss looked at Henrietta with those kind eyes and then at his wife, whose name turned out to be Clara, and Clara Voss looked at Henrietta with the sharp, perceptive gaze of a woman who had spent considerable time reading situations quickly. "Can you keep a ledger?" Clara Voss asked. "Yes," Henrietta said. "I also have familiarity with inventory management, correspondence, and the ordering of provisions from suppliers." Clara Voss smiled, and it transformed her sharp face entirely. "Well then," she said, "we have been needing someone for exactly those things since our last bookkeeper left to stake a mining claim in February." She looked at her husband. "Room above the store is still empty." "It is indeed," Hector Voss said. He looked at Henrietta. "It is not large, but it is clean. You would take meals with us and we would offer you a fair wage. Does that interest you, Miss Bell?" Henrietta felt the tightness in her chest, the tightness that had been there for weeks, that had settled in somewhere in Santa Fe and ridden all the way to this crossroads and this valley begin to ease. "Yes," she said, "it interests me very much." Peter Monroe spent that night at the Marable livery, which offered clean straw and fair rates, and a trough of water for his horses. and he found Henrietta the following morning at the Voss store, already behind the counter with a ledger open in front of her and a pen in her hand, and a look of focused concentration on her face that made him stand in the doorway for a moment before she noticed him. She looked up and her face changed, not dramatically, but in the small, clear way that faces change when they see something that gives them genuine pleasure. He noticed this. He stored it carefully. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. "You look like you belong there." "I intend to," she said. He bought some provisions for the road. He had a freight run scheduled from Marrable to a settlement called Chalk Creek, 2 days east, and while Clara Voss wrapped and tallied things at one end of the counter, he stood at the other end and talked with Henrietta in a quiet way that was really the continuation of the conversation they had been having for the past 2 days on the wagon. She told him more about her father, a man named Edmund Bell, who had run a small trading business out of Santa Fe, and had been, by her account, a gentle, bookish, somewhat impractical man who had loved his daughter unreservedly and taught her everything he knew about numbers and very little about how to protect herself from men like Silas Grange. She talked about growing up in Santa Fe, about the way the mountains looked from the plaza in the early morning, about learning to keep accounts at the age of 10 by helping her father with his ledgers. He listened to all of it. He told her that he had grown up in Kansas, on a homestead that his parents had tried to make work against considerable odds. His father had died of fever when Peter was 17, and Peter had sold the homestead to pay debts, a circumstance that felt, he said, not entirely unlike Henrietta's own situation, though without the added insult of someone trying to marry him off in lieu of repayment. He had drifted west after that, working various jobs, and had eventually settled into the freight business because it suited his nature. He was a man who liked moving, liked the particular freedom of the open road, but he also liked reliability and having something concrete and purposeful to do. "Do you ever think about staying in one place?" Henrietta asked. He thought about this. "I think about it more than I used to," he said, and he looked at her when he said it briefly and without fanfare and then looked away. She thought about that look for a long time after he left for Chalk Creek. She thought about it while she was reconciling the Voss store's accounts, which had gotten into a state of mild chaos during the absence of their previous bookkeeper, and while she was writing correspondence to 3 different suppliers in Tucson and Phoenix, and while she was eating dinner with Hector and Clara Voss in their warm kitchen, and listening to them argue cheerfully about whether the apple tree in the back would produce this year. She thought about the look and about the question, "Where do you want to go?" and about the way he had not hesitated at the Crossroads, and about his mother who had been brought somewhere she had not chosen to be, and about the woman in the unnamed town who had died in winter. She thought about the way he had said, "I believe you," when she had told him she intended to build a real life. Not "I suppose" or "I imagine you will manage" or "how admirable," but simply, "I believe you." Clara Voss found her at the window one evening, looking out at the main street of Marrable as the last of the light left it. "He will be back in about a week," Clara said, pouring 2 cups of tea at the little table by the window. She sat down and put 1 cup near Henrietta's elbow. Henrietta turned from the window with what she hoped was a composed expression. Clara Voss had the look of a woman not even slightly fooled by composed expressions. "He comes through Marrable regularly," Clara said. "Has for 3 years. Never stayed longer than his business required." She wrapped her hands around her tea-cup. "He stayed an extra day this time to make sure you were settled." Henrietta sat down. "He is a thoughtful man," she said. "He is," Clara agreed. "He is also, if you will forgive me for being direct, the loneliest man I have ever met who does not know he is lonely." Henrietta looked at her tea. "I am not in the business of telling women what to do with their hearts," Clara Voss said. "I am simply telling you what I know, because you seem to me like a woman who makes better decisions with good information." "That is accurate," Henrietta said. "Good," Clara said and drank her tea. The problem of Silas Grange arrived not in the form of Silas Grange himself, but in the form of 2 of his men, who rode into Marrable on a hot Wednesday morning 3 weeks after Henrietta had arrived, and started asking questions at the saloon about a dark-haired woman traveling alone. Henrietta did not hear about this immediately. She heard about it from the sheriff of Marrable, a compact, weathered man named Sheriff Dale Brent, who had heard about it from the saloon keeper, who had noticed the kind of questions being asked and the kind of manner in which they were being asked, and had drawn his own conclusions. Sheriff Brent came to the Voss store mid-morning and found Henrietta behind the counter. He took off his hat and spoke to her quietly and seriously, which she appreciated. "These men work for a Silas Grange in Tucson," the sheriff said. "Do you know who that is?" "I do," Henrietta said. He looked at her steadily. "Do you have any legal obligation to go with them? Any marriage contract, any signed document, anything of that nature?" "No," Henrietta said. "I signed nothing. My father signed nothing on my behalf regarding this. Whatever Grange believed himself to be owed, it was not formalized in any legal document I am aware of." Sheriff Brent nodded slowly. "Then they have no legal standing here," he said, "and I will tell them so directly." He paused. "But I want you to know they are here, and I want you to be careful." Henrietta thanked him and went to find Clara Voss, which was the sensible thing to do when you were new in a town and needed to understand how things worked. Clara was practical and swift. She and Hector consulted briefly in the kitchen, and then Hector went and had a word with a few men he knew in town, and Sheriff Brent went and had his conversation with Grange's men. And the long and short of it was that the two riders left Marrable that afternoon having been made clearly aware that the town was not inclined to cooperate with their employer's extra-legal property claims. Henrietta stood at the upper window of the store and watched them ride out and felt a cold, hard knot of anger in her stomach, not fear, though that was there too underneath, but mostly anger. Silas Grange had taken her father's death as an opportunity to collect a debt in the most obscene way imaginable, and the gall of it, the sheer audacious gall of it, made her clench her jaw until it ached. When Peter Monroe rode back into Marrable 8 days after he had left, Henrietta was waiting at the livery because she had seen his wagon coming down the main street from the upper window of the store, and had come down with a calmness she was using to contain something considerably less calm. He saw her standing there, and his gray eyes moved over her face, and he said, "What happened?" She told him everything, standing in the shade of the livery while he unhitched the horses. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment with his hands busy with the harness. "He will try again," he said. "I know," Henrietta said. "I am going to Tucson," Peter Monroe said. He said it in the flat, decided tone she had learned was his way of stating something he had already settled in his mind. "I need to have a conversation with Silas Grange." Henrietta looked at him sharply. "I do not want you doing anything dangerous on my account." "I am not going to do anything dangerous," Peter Monroe said. He looked at her. "I am going to have a conversation. I have some information about Grange's business practices that he would very much rather I not share with certain people, and I intend to make him a clear offer. He leaves you alone. I keep quiet about what I know." She stared at him. "You have what kind of information?" "The kind that accumulates when you have been hauling freight in and out of a man's ranch for 2 years, he said. "I have seen things I should probably have reported some time ago and did not because it was not my fight." He paused. "It is my fight now." Henrietta felt something fierce and warm move through her. She also felt the edge of something careful, something that needed to be said. "Peter," she said, using his name for the first time without thinking about it, and the syllable felt right in her mouth. "You have already done more for me than I can fully account for. You do not owe me this." He looked at her for a long, still moment. "I am aware that I do not owe you anything," he said. "I am doing it because I want to." Henrietta held his gaze and understood that there was more being said here than the words themselves contained. She understood it because she was a careful, observant woman who made decisions with good information, and the information being provided here was very clear. "All right," she said softly. "Be careful." "I will," he said. "I always am." He left for Tucson the following morning at first light, and the 3 days he was gone were among the longest Henrietta had spent since arriving in Marable, which surprised her. She had not expected to feel his absence so acutely. She was not a woman given to depending on anyone. She had learned not to be. And yet there was a particular quality to the town during those 3 days that felt different from the town during the 8 days of his first absence. Quieter somehow. More muted. Clara Voss noticed, as Clara Voss noticed everything and said nothing, as she occasionally had the wisdom to do. Peter Monroe returned on the third evening with dust on his coat and a thoughtful expression that gradually relaxed over the course of a bowl of Clara Voss's bean soup. He told Henrietta afterward, in 2 chairs on the porch of the store, while the evening air came in cool off the mountains, what had happened in Tucson. Silas Grange was a man in his late 50s, who had spent 30 years accumulating power in a part of the territory where power could be accumulated through a combination of money, charm, and selective information management. Peter had spent 2 years hauling freight to and from Grange's operation, and had, in that time, observed certain discrepancies between what Grange reported to the territorial tax authorities and what was actually moved through his ranch. He had also observed certain arrangements between Grange and a land agent that did not entirely align with what the homesteaders on the adjacent properties would have been told. He had gone to Grange directly. He had sat in Grange's office, a large, comfortable room that Peter described as the room of a man very invested in his own importance. And he had explained, simply and without particular heat, that he was in possession of information that would be of considerable interest to the territorial tax collector, the land registration office, and possibly the federal marshal's office in Prescott, and that he had no particular desire to share this information with anyone, provided that certain conditions were met. What conditions? Grange had asked, with the controlled contempt of a man who does not like being backed into corners. Henrietta Bell is not your debt to collect, Peter had said. Her father's estate is a matter for the civil courts, not for private arrangement. You will not send men to find her. You will not pursue the matter further. The debt, such as it is, dies with Edmund Bell, and you will recognize it as such. Grange had attempted several different conversational approaches: threat, appeal to business relationship, the suggestion that Peter Monroe was overestimating the value of what he thought he knew. Peter had sat through all of them without particular agitation, and at the end of each one had simply said the same thing in slightly different words. Eventually, Grange had agreed. He had agreed with the tight, bloodless expression of a man who knows he has lost a negotiation and is already beginning to reframe it as something else in his own mind, but he had agreed. He will honor it, Peter told Henrietta on the porch. Men like Grange honor arrangements like this because the alternative is worse for them. He is not a man who will sacrifice his operation for pride. Henrietta sat very still in her chair, looking at the darkening street. She felt something she could only describe as a profound and exhausting relief, the kind of relief that comes from putting down something heavy that you have been carrying for a long time without quite realizing how much it was costing you. I do not know how to thank you, she said. You do not need to thank me, Peter said. I know I do not need to, she said. I want to. There is a difference. He looked at her in the quiet of the evening, and she looked back at him, and the air between them felt dense with something that had been accumulating since the Crossroads. Since the moment he had looked at her wrists and taken out his knife without hesitation. You have been in Marable 3 weeks, he said. Yes, she said. Does it feel like somewhere you want to stay? She thought about the ledgers and the Voss kitchen and the mountains turning purple in the afternoon light, and the way the main street smelled of horses and dust and wood smoke. She thought about Clara Voss's tea and Hector Voss's gentle arguments about the apple tree and Sheriff Brent's compact, reliable fairness. Yes, she said. It feels like somewhere I want to stay. He nodded. He looked at his hands. My freight route, he said. I could adjust it. There are runs I make that go through Marable as a natural stop. I could make it a more regular stop. Henrietta looked at him. She could feel her heart doing something undignified and did not mind it. "I would like that," she said with quiet directness. He looked at her then, fully and without reservation, and what was in his gray eyes was something open and warm and real, and she met it with her own eyes and did not look away. "Good," he said simply. And that was how it began, not with drama or grand declaration, but with a porch and an evening and two honest people deciding that the space between them was not a space they wanted anymore. Over the following months, Marable became the rhythm of Henrietta's life. She worked the Voss store with an industry and precision that quickly made her indispensable, reorganizing the accounting system and bringing the ordering into a proper inventory cycle, and beginning to correspond, on Clara's behalf, with suppliers in Tucson and Phoenix who were considerably more responsive to a well-composed letter than to the hastily scribbled notes that had previously characterized the store's communication with the outside world. She became, in the gradual way that belonging happens in small towns, a part of the fabric of Marable. She knew the names of the families who came into the store. She knew which children were which, and who was having difficulty paying their accounts, and who had too much pride to ask for credit and needed to be offered it sideways, as if it were simply an administrative convenience rather than a kindness. She sat in one of the churches on Sunday mornings, not because she was a deeply religious woman in the formal sense, but because the community of it mattered to her, the gathering of people in a shared space, the reminder that she was not alone. And Peter Monroe came back. He came back every 3 weeks, sometimes every 2, making his freight run with the bay mare and the roan, always arriving in the late afternoon when the light was long and copper, and making the whole town look better than it probably deserved. He would unload his freight at the various stops along the main street, and then he would come to the Voss store, and whatever Henrietta was doing when he arrived, she always knew when he arrived, in the way that you come to know certain sounds and presences without having to consciously attend to them. They always talked. They talked in the store and on the porch and at the Voss dinner table, and on walks along the edge of town when the evenings were cool enough to make walking pleasant. They talked about everything about the territory and the changes coming to it, the railroad pushing in from the east and what it would mean for places like Marable, about the Apache situation that had been simmering in the southern part of the territory, and the profound injustice of how the Apache people had been treated, driven from their lands by government policy and violence and the relentless greed of settlement. Peter spoke about this with a quiet anger that Henrietta recognized as the anger of a man who had seen things directly and could not pretend otherwise, and she listened with the seriousness it deserved, because the displacement and suffering of the Apache people was real, and it was ongoing, and it was one of the ugliest threads running through the story of the Arizona Territory in 1882. They talked about books. She was a reader of whatever she could find, which in Marable was somewhat limited but more than you might expect, since Clara Voss had a particular fondness for novels and kept a small but respectable collection. And she discovered that Peter Monroe, who looked like a man who spent all his time outdoors and none of it at a desk, had read considerably more than she had anticipated. "Where did you find the time?" she asked once, genuinely curious. "Long nights on the road," he said. "A book and a fire and nobody wanting to talk at you." She laughed, which was something she was finding she did more frequently in his presence than anywhere else, and he smiled at the sound of it. A real smile, the full version of the partial one she had first seen on the road, and it changed his face the way weather changes a landscape, making it suddenly and completely different. In the evenings when he stayed, after the Vosses had gone to bed and the store was locked and quiet, they would sometimes sit on the porch together long past the point when the air had turned cold, wrapped in their coats, talking or sometimes not talking at all, simply sitting in the comfortable silence they had established almost from the beginning. One such evening in late October, when the mountains were covered in snow above the timberline and the air smelled of wood fires, Peter Monroe said, without particular preamble, "I have been thinking about what you said, about staying in one place." Henrietta looked at him. The lamplight from the store window fell across half his face, leaving the other half in shadow. "What have you been thinking about it?" she asked. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "that I have been on the road for 11 years. And that I am 33 years old, and that I have come to look forward to this town more than I look forward to any other stop on any route I have ever run." He paused. "And that the reason I look forward to it has very little to do with the town itself." Henrietta's heart was doing that undignified thing again, and she did not mind it at all. "Peter," she said, "I'm not good at this kind of talking," he said. "I want to be honest about that. I can say exactly what I mean in a business conversation or when I need to tell someone an unpleasant truth, but this kind of talking, I'm not practiced at it." "You are doing fine," she said softly. He looked at her. "I have been in love with you since that Crossroads," he said, "or near enough to it that the difference does not matter. And I understand that you came to Marable to build your own life, which you are doing, and which is yours to build however you choose. I'm not asking you to give that up. I'm asking if there is space in it for me." The desert was very quiet. The fire was burning in the store window, and the mountains were invisible in the dark, and the stars were thick and brilliant overhead. Henrietta turned in her chair to face him fully. "I have been in love with you since you asked me where I wanted to go," she said. "Since that exact moment. Because I had not been asked that before by anyone, and you asked it like my answer mattered, which it did, and which most people seem to have forgotten." Peter Monroe looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached over and took her hand slowly and deliberately, with the same quality of decision he brought to everything, and held it on the arm of her chair. "Your answer always matters," he said. "I know that now," she said. "Because of you." They sat together in the October cold with their hands linked between their chairs, and the night was very large and very beautiful around them, and neither of them needed to say anything more for a long while. The winter of 1882 passed into the spring of 1883 in a gradual, and not always comfortable way, as winters in the Arizona Territory tend to do. There were cold snaps and mud, and the occasional late storm that made the roads miserable. And on 2 occasions Peter Monroe's freight run was delayed by weather, which meant he arrived in Marable a week later than expected, and Henrietta had to manage the particular restlessness of waiting, without becoming someone who waited badly. She was not naturally a patient person. She was a person who got things done and felt the friction of inaction, and she channeled this into the work at the store, which expanded under her management in several useful directions. She began keeping track of what the town's families needed that the store did not currently carry, and she put together a series of orders from suppliers in Phoenix that brought in goods previously unavailable in Marable, which pleased the townspeople considerably and increased the store's revenue in ways that made Hector Voss look at her over his spectacles with an expression of cheerful astonishment. "You are extraordinary," Hector told her one afternoon. "I am organized," Henrietta corrected. "Most situations improve significantly when someone is organized." Peter Monroe asked her to marry him on a Tuesday in April of 1883, which was not the most romantic of days, but was the day he happened to arrive in Marable with a ring he had had made by a silversmith in Prescott. A simple silver band with a small turquoise stone set in it, because he had noticed that she always looked at the turquoise jewelry in the store's display case with a particular appreciation she never voiced. He gave it to her at the counter of the store, with Hector Voss conspicuously busy at the far end of the room, and Clara Voss conspicuously busy in the back. He held it out and said, with the straightforwardness she had come to love as one of his defining qualities, "Henrietta Bell, I would like very much to be your husband. I would like to settle in Marable and build something here with you. I have some savings and a good business that can be run with Marable as its base. I think we would be good together. I think we already are good together." He paused. "But the only thing that matters is what you want, so I am asking." What do you want?" Henrietta looked at the ring in his palm and then up at his face and felt the fullness of this moment. The distance she had traveled from that crossroads, from the rope and the dust and the two men counting coins without consulting her, to this counter, this store, this man asking her what she wanted. "Yes," she said. "I want to marry you. I want to build something here with you. And that ring is exactly what I would have chosen myself." The smile that broke across Peter Monroe's face was something she intended to remember for the rest of her life. Clara Voss said, "Finally." From somewhere in the back room, loud enough to be heard clearly despite the closed door, and Hector Voss laughed from behind the far end of the counter, and Henrietta looked at Peter Monroe and laughed too, and he was already laughing, and the store was full of it. They were married in June of 1883 in the smaller of Marrable's two churches, with the Voss family standing as their only formal witnesses. Hector solid and pleased, Clara magnificent in a good wool dress that she wore with the air of a woman attending a coronation she had personally arranged. The Reverend was a lean, dry man named Thomas Hook who had a gift for brevity, and the ceremony was short and honest, and exactly what both of them wanted. Sheriff Brent shook Peter's hand afterward and said he was glad to see a good man staying in one place. The women of the town brought food to the little reception in the churchyard, and there was lemonade and cake, and 3 men with a fiddle and 2 guitars who played dance music until the evening turned cold, and Henrietta danced with her husband in the churchyard of Marrable, Arizona, with the mountains surrounding the valley in all directions, and the sky going from pink to gold to deep blue above them, and she was so acutely, physically happy that it was almost startling, like suddenly discovering a sense you had not known you were missing. Peter Monroe was not a dancer in the formal sense, but he was a man with good rhythm and a willingness to try, and he managed the basic steps with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else, and he held her properly and looked at her while they danced with the expression of a man who can still barely believe his luck. "You are staring at me," she told him. "Yes," he agreed unabashedly. "Why?" "Because you are my wife," he said, "and because you are the most remarkable woman I have ever met, and because I want to." Henrietta pressed her face briefly against his shoulder, so he could not see the expression on her face, which was the expression of a woman whose happiness has temporarily overwhelmed her composure. They set up home in the rooms above the Voss store, which were expanded through the summer of 1883, when Peter hired 2 men from the town to add a proper bedroom and a sitting room with south-facing windows, and Henrietta furnished them with the particular care of a woman who has not had a home of her own choosing before and intends to do it right. She kept a kitchen table near the window so she could look out at the main street while she worked. She put shelves on the wall for her books. Clara had given her several as a wedding gift, and she had ordered more from a bookseller in San Francisco through a catalog that had finally made its way to the Voss store, and she put Peter's one framed photograph, which was of the Kansas homestead where he had grown up, on the shelf beside them, because she wanted his history as well as her own to have a place in this home they were making. Peter formally settled in Marrable and rebuilt his freight business with Marrable as its center point. He hired a young man named Will Cutter, who was 18 and energetic and very good with horses, to help manage the longer runs, and between the two of them they built a reliable operation that served 6 settlements in the area. He built a proper freight office at the edge of town, a small but solid building with a corral attached, and Henrietta sometimes handled the office correspondence when she had time away from the Voss store, her clear, precise handwriting covering pages of orders and receipts and contracts. Life in Marrable in the years that followed had the quality of something built on solid ground, not without storms, because nothing worth having is without storms, but with a foundation that held through them. There were difficult things. The winter of 1884 was brutal and took one of the town's elderly residents, old Jacob Marsh, who had been among the town's original settlers, and whose death was mourned with the particular weight that comes from losing someone who carries a place's history in them. There was a dispute in 1884 between two ranching families on the western edge of the valley that took Sheriff Brent and 3 months of careful negotiation to resolve without violence. The railroad did come to the territory, as Peter had predicted, and it changed things in the way that things are changed by large unstoppable forces, some good, some not, and the sorting out of which took years. Henrietta's relationship with the Voss store continued to deepen and grow. By 1885, she had taken on a formal partnership with Hector and Clara, contributing capital from her accumulated savings and earning a full stake in the business. Clara, whose sharp intelligence had always impressed her, became one of her closest friends, and their friendship had the quality of two capable women who had each recognized in the other someone worth knowing. Peter remained the steadiest thing in her life, which she had not quite expected when she had married him, not because she had doubted him, but because she had not previously believed that steadiness of that kind was possible to find. He was present in the real sense, the attending sense, not simply physically occupying the same space. He noticed things about her. When she was tired, when something was worrying her, when she needed company, and when she needed to be left alone to think, and he responded to each with the same quiet accuracy that he brought to everything he did. They disagreed sometimes, because two strong-minded, intelligent people will disagree, and their disagreements had a quality Henrietta had come to appreciate. They were direct and honest, and neither of them retreated into silence or performance, and they always came back to the thing they were actually disagreeing about rather than the larger territory of grievance that couples can sometimes get lost in. She had told him, early in their marriage, that she intended always to tell him the truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable, and he had told her the same thing with the gravity of a man making a real promise, and they had both kept this commitment in the years that followed. The summer of 1885 brought their first child, a boy they named Edmund, after Henrietta's father, which had been Peter's suggestion, offered without ceremony, and with the understanding that she might feel differently. She had not felt differently. She had looked at her husband when he suggested it and felt the by now familiar fullness of being known, truly known, by another person. Edmund Peter Monroe arrived on a hot August night with Clara Voss, in attendance as midwife, and Hector pacing in the kitchen below in a state of anxious solidarity, and Peter sitting at Henrietta's bedside through the whole of it, holding her hand and talking to her in a low, steady voice whenever she needed to hear a voice, and being quiet whenever she needed quiet. And in the hours before dawn, Edmund arrived red-faced and vigorous and aggressively alive, with a set of lungs that made his opinion of the world immediately and forcefully known. Peter Monroe held his son for the first time with the expression of a man standing in the middle of something he cannot find the edges of, and Henrietta watched him from the bed and felt her heart do the undignified thing again and loved it. "Hello, Edmund," Peter said to the baby, very quietly and seriously, as if greeting him with proper respect. Edmund stared at the ceiling with the unfocused intensity of newborns and did not respond. "He will warm up to you," Henrietta said from the pillow. Peter looked up at her, and his gray eyes were bright in a way she had never quite seen in them before. "He is extraordinary," he said. "He is," Henrietta agreed, "though I may be biased." "You may be," Peter said. "I am certainly biased." Edmund Monroe grew into a robust and somewhat headstrong toddler who had his mother's quick intelligence and his father's quiet observational quality, and who was, by the general consensus of Marrable, a thoroughly engaging child. He spent a great deal of time in the freight office watching the horses with a focused intensity that suggested early vocational interests, and a great deal of time in the general store helping, as he understood it, by rearranging the lower shelves, which Henrietta had learned to take in stride. The Voss store continued to grow. By 1886, It was unambiguously the most well-run commercial establishment in the valley, and merchants from neighboring settlements came to it for goods they could not find elsewhere. Hector Voss, who was not a man given to effusive praise but was a man given to honest assessment, told Henrietta in the fall of 1886 that the store was twice the business it had been when she had arrived, which he attributed entirely to her. She told him it was the three of them together, which was partly true and partly the kind of gracious deflection that she occasionally allowed herself. In the spring of 1887, Will Cutter, who had been working for Peter Monroe for 4 years by then, and had grown from an energetic 18-year-old into a capable, reliable young man of 22, asked Peter for a raise, which Peter gave him without argument because it was deserved, and also because Will Cutter had in the same conversation mentioned, with some awkwardness, that he was hoping to ask a girl named Mee Hollister to court him, and he needed to be in a position to do so with some financial seriousness. Peter had listened to this with an expression Henrietta later described as trying very hard not to smile, which was accurate, and had given Will not only the raise but also, apparently, some brief advice on the subject of asking women what they wanted, which Will later told me, and which me later told Henrietta over tea, creating a moment of quiet hilarity that kept Henrietta warm for several days. In the summer of 1887, Henrietta discovered she was expecting a second child. This was welcome news, received with considerable joy by Peter and with celebratory baking from Clara Voss, and with a great deal of enthusiastic incomprehension from Edmund, who was 2 and had not yet developed a complete theory of where babies came from. This second pregnancy was more difficult than the first. She tired more easily, and there were 2 weeks in the fall when she was ill enough that she had to stay away from the store, which she found more frustrating than the physical discomfort. Peter took over a portion of her store work during this time with a practical willingness that required no comment or management from her, simply showing up and doing it. "You do not have to do that," she told him. "I know," he said, and kept doing it. She loved him in moments like this with a love that was not romantic in the hearts and flowers sense, but was something more substantial and more permanent. The love of a woman who knows that the person beside her is genuinely, reliably good, not as a performance or a strain, but as a simple fact of who they are. In February of 1888, they had a daughter. She arrived in the middle of a snowstorm that had turned the streets of Marrable white for the first time anyone could remember, and she arrived with considerably less drama than her brother, but with an expression, from the very first moment, of supreme alertness, dark eyes already open and looking at the world with the focused attention of someone planning to take it seriously. "She has your eyes," Peter said. "She has your expression," Henrietta said. "She looks like she is already making decisions." "Then she is definitely yours," he said, and kissed her temple and held his daughter carefully. They named her Alice, because Henrietta had always loved the name and Peter said it suited her, and Alice Monroe settled into the household with the placid authority of a younger sibling who has assessed the situation and found it adequate. Edmund, at 2½, approached Alice with the cautious diplomatic manner of a small person entering a new foreign territory, which eventually resolved itself into a proprietary protectiveness that was both touching and somewhat overbearing, and which Alice would spend considerable time in the subsequent years making clear was unnecessary. Life in Marrable moved forward through the late 1880s with the steady momentum of a place that has found its footing. The town grew, new families arriving, drawn by the railroad's proximity, and the valley's good grazing and the reputation, which spread gradually by word of mouth, of Marrable as a place with decent law, decent commerce, and decent community. The Voss store expanded its building by 1888, adding a second room for hardware and ranch supplies. Hector Voss talked often about retirement and did nothing about it, which Clara found endlessly amusing. Peter Monroe's freight business had by this point become something more substantial than a one-man-and-a-wagon operation. He had 4 employees: Will Cutter, now formerly a partner in the operation, and 3 other men, and a small fleet of wagons, and a reputation for reliability that extended well beyond the immediate area. He was not a wealthy man in the territorial sense, but he was a prosperous one. And more than the prosperity, what he had was work he was proud of and a life that felt, he told Henrietta one evening, like something he had built rather than something that had happened to him. "There is a difference," Henrietta said. "Yes," he agreed, "there is a very large difference." She knew what he meant because she felt it too, the specific quality of a life that has been chosen. She had thought about this often in the years since the Crossroads, about the way that single question had changed everything. Not because of what her answer had been north, toward Marable, but because the answer had been hers to give. Because someone had stopped in the Arizona heat and the road dust and asked her where she wanted to go, and meant it, and then taken her there. She had told this story to several people over the years in various forms. She told it in full to Clara Voss once, sitting in Clara's kitchen with tea going cold between them. Clara had listened without interruption, which was unusual for Clara, and at the end she had been quiet for a moment and then said, "He is a good man." "He is," Henrietta had said. "And you are a good woman," Clara said. "Do not forget that part. He asked the question. You knew the answer. That required something too." Henrietta had thought about that, about what it had required. To know, in the middle of an Arizona crossroads with dust on your dress and rope marks on your wrists, not just what you were running from, but what, if given the choice, you would choose. She thought she might not have had that clarity if her father had not given her the gift of his books and his ledgers, and his unfashionable conviction that his daughter's mind was worth developing. Edmund Bell had not known how to protect his daughter from Sela's Grange, but he had given her the tools to protect herself, and she honored his memory by using them. In 1889, Sheriff Dale Brent retired after 12 years as Marable's sheriff, and at the town meeting where his replacement was discussed, 3 different people independently suggested Peter Monroe's name before the meeting had proceeded very far. Peter, who was in attendance and had not been expecting this, went very still in a way that Henrietta, sitting beside him, recognized as surprise managing itself. "I am a freight hauler," he said. "You are a man with good judgment, a steady head, and the respect of this town," said Reverend Hook, with his gift for brevity. It took some considerable time and 3 subsequent conversations, one with Henrietta, one with Will Cutter about the business, and one long evening on the porch by himself, before Peter Monroe agreed to stand for the position, and when the town voted in the manner of small Western towns in 1889, he won without meaningful opposition. He took the role with the same quality he brought to everything, without pomp, without drama, with careful attention, and a steadiness that the town found deeply reassuring. He was not a sheriff who looked for confrontation, but he was absolutely not one who avoided it when it was necessary. And Marable, which had grown enough by this point to have its share of difficulties, settled under his watch with the comfort of a town that trusts its institutions. Henrietta was proud of him, in a way that occasionally startled her with its intensity. She had loved him from near the beginning, but watching him become this, watching him take the thing he had with the freight business, that quality of showing up and doing the work and being reliable, and apply it to the broader project of the town's well-being. She loved him in this with a particular addition. She told him this on one of the evenings when he had come in late and she had kept supper warm, and he looked at her across the kitchen table with the quiet directness that had never changed in all the years she had known him and said, "You made me want to be worth something to this place." "You already were," she said. "More so," he said, "because of you." Edmund Monroe, at 4 years old in 1889, was very impressed that his father wore a badge, and spent a period of approximately 3 weeks insisting on being addressed as Deputy Edmund, a title that no one in the household accorded him the dignity of using seriously, which did not in any way diminish his commitment to the role. Alice Monroe, at 1 year old, was indifferent to the badge but extremely interested in the hat. The years that followed built upon each other in the way that good years do, each one adding something, changing something, sometimes taking something but always leaving the essential thing intact. The essential thing was this: two people who had met at a crossroads in the Arizona desert in the spring of 1882, who had chosen each other freely and continued choosing each other every day in the small and large ways that choosing happens, who had built a home and a business and a family in a valley in the territory, and who had made something real. By 1891, Edmund was in the Marable School and distinguishing himself primarily in arithmetic, which pleased his mother, and secondarily in argument, which pleased her slightly less but which she recognized as an inevitable inheritance. Alice was 3 and walking with the determined authority of a small person who has decided that the available world does not fully appreciate her potential. Will Cutter and Mee Hollister had married in 1888 and had a son of their own who Edmund had decided was his particular responsibility, which Will and Mee found both touching and exhausting. The Voss store had grown, over the years, into something that Hector Voss sometimes stood back and looked at with a slow, wondering expression, as if he could not quite trace the line from the modest dry goods operation he had opened in 1875 to the substantial commercial establishment it had become. Clara Voss had not slowed down at all, which Hector also looked at with slow wonder, though with different feelings. On a warm evening in September of 1891, Henrietta and Peter sat on the porch of their home, expanded from the original rooms above the store to proper house on the south edge of town, with the apple tree that Hector had always doubted now growing in the backyard and producing with unnecessary abundance. And the evening was the perfect temperature, and the mountains were purple in the distance, and the main street of Marable was quiet in the way that small towns are quiet in the evening. Not empty but settled, with lights in windows and the occasional sound of a door or a voice. Edmund was inside at the kitchen table with his arithmetic, having been firmly installed there by his mother. Alice was asleep, having surrendered to sleep with the reluctant resignation she always brought to it. The porch was quiet. Henrietta had her feet tucked up on the chair and her arms around her knees, and she was looking at the mountains, and Peter was beside her with his hat on the porch railing, and his long legs stretched out and his hands folded. "Do you remember the Crossroads?" she said. She said it without context because she knew he would know what she meant. "Every day," he said. She looked at him. "What do you think about when you remember it?" He was quiet for a moment in his considering way. "I think about how close I came to just doing the job," he said. "How easy it would have been to just tell myself it was not my business." "But you did not," she said. "No," he said. "I looked at your wrists and I looked at your face and I thought, this is not right. This is a person who has not been asked anything." He paused. "And I thought about the things I should have done differently in my life, and I decided that here was a simple thing I could do right." Henrietta unfolded herself from her chair and moved to his, which was not really big enough for 2 people, but managed the situation adequately. He put his arm around her and she settled against him and they looked at the mountains together. "A simple thing," she said. "It felt simple," he said. "I cannot claim it felt like a great moral reckoning. It just felt like here is a woman who needs someone to ask her what she wants, and I know how to ask that." "It was not simple," she said. "It cost you the job and the payment and the business relationship with Grange, and then it cost you a trip to Tucson to settle the whole thing." "It was not simple at all." "No," he admitted, "but it was clear." She pressed closer to him and felt his arm tighten around her, and the evening was warm and the mountains were purple and the apple tree in the backyard was making its autumn preparations, and their son was doing his arithmetic inside, and their daughter was asleep in her room, and the town that had become their town was settling into its evening, and everything that mattered was exactly where it was supposed to be. "I did not know what I wanted," she said. "When you asked me, I had to think." "You knew," he said. "You just needed a moment to hear yourself." She smiled against his shoulder. "Marable," she said. "Marable," he agreed. She lifted her head and looked at him, and the light was fading, and his face was familiar to her in the way that the best faces become familiar, not through repetition alone, but through accumulated understanding, through all the conversations and all the silences and all the ordinary, extraordinary days of a life built together. "I would choose it again," she said. "Every part of it. The crossroads and the wagon and Marable and you, especially you." Peter Monroe looked at her with his gray eyes that were not stormy at all. She had decided long ago, but were the color of the sky just after a storm, when the air is clean and everything is clear. "I would choose it again too," he said. "Every part, especially you." He kissed her in the quiet of the porch while the last light left the mountains and the first stars came out over the valley, and the kiss had in it all the years and all the choices and all the distance from the crossroads to this porch. And it was, as all the best things between them were, simple and clear and exactly enough. Inside the house, Edmund Monroe called out that he had finished his arithmetic and wanted to know if he could come outside, and his mother called back that yes, he could come outside. And the screen door opened, and a small determined figure appeared on the porch and wedged himself into the space between his parents with the confidence of a person who has never doubted that he belongs, and looked out at the evening with his mother's dark eyes and his father's quiet expression. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "The mountains," his mother said. "And the stars," his father said. Edmund Monroe looked at the mountains and the stars with the focused attention of a boy who took things seriously. "Good," he said, and that was all, and they sat together on the porch of their house in Marable, Arizona, in the fall of 1891, looking at the mountains and the stars, and the night came in gently around them, and the apple tree rustled its autumn leaves in the backyard, and Alice Monroe slept in her room dreaming whatever dreams belong to 3-year-olds. And the town settled into its night, and Peter Monroe and Henrietta Bell Monroe sat in the warmth of all they had built together and were exactly, completely, thoroughly home.